All right, good morning slash afternoon to everybody here for the 32nd episode of Pick and Pop. This is on last night, and I kind of feel stupid because yesterday I was talking about how the Jazz weren't going to win a game in the series, that they were so outmatched that I would have rather have had Oklahoma City move on just because it would have been a better matchup, that especially it wasn't going to happen in Houston. And yet this Utah Jazz team, like they have done all year, continue to prove people like me wrong. And this is a team that, of course, doesn't have the stacked roster. There was even more doubt instilled in them after losing Ricky Rubio for most likely this series, having to have Royce O'Neal start at the point guard spot. But yesterday, the Utah Jazz proved that sometimes it is the mental fortitude and the energy that you bring to a game that can allow you to win. And you look back at game one where they were just blown out of the water essentially right away. Ended up losing that game by 14 points, but that was a lot closer than what it actually was, as Utah had been outscored by 13 in the first quarter and then 12 in the second quarter in game one. And this was a pretty close game for the early going, but Utah ended up taking control late in the first quarter and into the second quarter, had a pretty nice lead at halftime of 9 points. Houston came back in the third. It was a tie game. And then what happened next was something that probably nobody expected to happen, which was the Utah Jazz being the team that took control in the fourth quarter. They outscored Houston by 7 in the quarter. They ended up winning the game by 8. I think the wildest thing was this wasn't a Donovan Mitchell, superstar show. There weren't really any crazy games that Utah had. It was just a lot of really helpful performances, most notably by Joe Ingles, who was 7 of 9 from 3 in 35 and a half minutes, put up 27 points. Then you get 17 and 11 assists from Donovan Mitchell to go with 5 rebounds. You get 15 points, 3 blocks, and 14 rebounds from Rudy Gobert, arguably the league's best defender. And then you go to the bench, you finally get a really good game out of Jay Crowder, who gave you 15 and 10, and he gets 17, 4, and 6 out of Alec Burks. So Utah had a really balanced effort. They had a really strong rotation, were able to keep guys in and out of the game and fresh at a pretty good rate. And as far as Houston goes, they just really weren't able to get any of their other shooters going to make up for what they weren't getting from their stars. And while James Harden left the arena last night with 32.6 rebounds and 11 assists, a stat line that superficially looks like you should be able to win a game with that being the performance of your best player, but not when it's on 9 of 22 shooting, not when it's on 2 of 10 from 3. And that he got 12 of those 32 points from the free throw line, which was ultimately probably the biggest strength of James Harden. And what makes him so unguardable is that he could draw a foul anywhere in the half court at any time and typically does do that. So even in an off game, he was still able to produce 32 points. But when you're not hitting your 3-pointers, something that the Houston Rockets have lived and died by for the last 3 to 4 years, it's going to be tough to win a game, no matter who you're playing or no matter where you are. And the Rockets were 10 of 37 from 3 last night. That's well below their season average. It usually hovers around 16. And 27% from 3. They were 38 and 95 total. Eric Gordon was 5 of 16 from the field off the bench at 15 points. And as far as 3-pointers go, 1 of 4 from Trevor Ariza, 1 of 5 from PJ Tucker, and then 2 of 10 from James Harden. They were 2 of 5 from Chris Paul. So he was able to shoot 40% from 3, but he didn't have a game that really made up for what James Harden couldn't bring to the table shooting wise. He was 23, 5, 3, and 3. So only 3 assists for Chris Paul. This is where, you gotta kind of be concerned with this point. If you're the Houston Rockets, just because, I think we've seen this at previous points, both in this postseason, most notably in Game 3 against Minnesota, but also in the regular season in games that Houston struggled, is that, when things really get down to it and when Houston has pressure applied to them, they kind of lose their identity of being able to move the ball around a lot. And that really, I think, the most glaring instance was when it happened in Minnesota in Game 3. The Rockets only had 18 assists in that game where they lost by 16. And then if you take a look at what happened in last night's game, they end up with just 22 assists, which is a decent amount for most teams. But when you're the Houston Rockets, who play with the system like they do, and you have a guy like Chris Paul, you're really supposed to be racking up at least 25, probably in the range of 27 to 30 a night for you to have a really good chance at winning a game. And especially when Utah had all of their cylinders firing from the guys that they needed it from, like Jay Crowder, like Alec Burks, like Joe Ingles, that really put the pressure on Houston, and they weren't able to respond with a Trevor Ariza, PJ Tucker, Eric Gordon. They just weren't able to counter what Utah was bringing to the table from their supplementary pieces. And even though Donovan Mitchell was 6 of 21 from the field, he was still able to give you 11 assists, something that he typically isn't able to do when he's scoring. So he was really able to offset his lack of offensive production by being able to move the ball and create plays. And the Jazz were able to squeak out a win here. And this game was really entertaining. It was really surprising. But I think one thing it just kind of solidified for me is that you can't really write the Rockets in as the best team in basketball. And B, related to the first point, I'm taking the Warriors in a 7-game series against the Houston Rockets. And while they've been able to hide their inconsistency at times by being able to end the game with a win, especially when they have James Harden, Chris Paul, and Clint Capella on the floor, there have been a lot of times where the pressure has gotten to them and they've been able to squeak out wins in the regular season. But now that we're getting to the postseason, they're playing teams that are really giving them significant challenges. They're finding themselves to be really uncomfortable when put in those tough positions, when they're forced to do things that they usually don't. And when the Rockets start missing threes, that's when that has to happen. So, Utah, obviously an extremely good defensive team who, as I just mentioned, arguably has the best defender in basketball. But at the same time, even if they are defending you extremely well, if you live and die by making 3-pointers, they're going to have to make them well defended or not. And while I don't think that this is cause of concern for the series for the Rockets, I do think it's an incredibly impressive win for the Jazz and a big wake-up call for Houston that there are still major adjustments that need to be made, that if they are not in rhythm, if the game is not going at their pace in the way that they want it to go, they are really put in a tough position and may end up losing the game. For example, the pace in last night's game was 102.2. That's the amount of possessions per 100 minutes. And the Rockets, as far as their pace of the year, actually played much slower at 97.6, which I actually didn't expect. I thought that would be a higher number. But that does still correlate with how Houston plays as far as the amount of ball movement that they have in the half court in trying to set up the most open possible look at a 3-pointer. And that's what really makes it tough and goes back to the point about their assists. When you only have 22 assists, and you're still attempting 37 3-pointers, that's almost kind of referencing the fact that you're taking threes that probably aren't really good looks. You're forcing shots up. You're not moving the ball. You're not creating the high percentage shots, even if they are threes. So Houston certainly has to make a lot of adjustments. It's going to be a bit more difficult because they are going in probably the most hostile environment left in the NBA playoffs in Salt Lake City, Utah. It's going to be a very difficult place to play for the Houston Rockets, but at the same time, I anticipate a pretty aggressive response. I do think that Utah can certainly win one of these games at home, which would even up the series. I think Houston's either going to win both or split, but I think Utah certainly feels really rejuvenated and encouraged by the results of last night's game, especially because it was a game that was won in the fourth quarter, which makes it all the more impressive, something that, isn't always easy to do if you're a team on the road in the playoffs and you're a heavy underdog, being able to stay in a game for that long and then be able to close it out when Houston had everything going. That's extremely impressive, and it was a really impressive win for Utah. I still like Houston in the series for sure, but I do think that they have to make really notable adjustments because Utah is going to have the energy of being back in Salt Lake City, and if they get into a rhythm, they can do what they did to Oklahoma City and jump up 3-1 right then and there. So you really just never know. But I do think Houston's at least going to win a game once they go back to Salt Lake City. There are 2 games going on tonight both of which in the Eastern Conference between the Celtics and the 76ers and the Cavaliers and the Raptors, both of them game 2. Cleveland had that big road overtime victory in game 1, really putting Toronto with their back against the wall early in the series, trying to go up 2-0 on the road before heading back to Cleveland. Of course, as I've talked about at length, really since the regular season, how Cleveland just doesn't have the firepower that they've had in years past and don't have the roster that could really match up with Toronto effectively. This is still a game that they can very much so win. And I do think that if they do win, Toronto's in a really tough spot. I think that this game is really leaning towards the definition of a must win for Toronto. You go on the road for 2 games in Cleveland where they already kind of have that mental edge over you, the history of having the Cavaliers beat the Raptors last 2 years in the playoffs. Piled on top of the fact that the Raptors have never had higher expectations, that they should be the team that goes to the NBA Finals out of the East. Though that's all kind of factoring into the pressure that's on this Toronto team. And I think if they lose tonight, that's only going to be magnified and would make it extremely difficult for Toronto to win the series. With that all being said, I think you can expect a much more productive offensive performance from DeMar DeRozan. And by productive, I more so mean aggressive. He wasn't bad in game 1, but he only had 22 points in the overtime game. I think you're going to see him take a lot more shots. You're going to see a lot of Jonas Valanciunas still, who had 21 and 21. And they're certainly going to look for a big game from Fred VanVleet off the bench and hoping that perhaps his shoulder is healed a bit more and that he'll be able to get those shots up and in at a more consistent rate. Second game between the Sixers and the Celtics. It looks like Jaylen Brown will still be out for tonight's game, which certainly favors Philadelphia looking to make those adjustments based on game 1, and they won't have to worry about another piece coming back. So in that sense, I do like Philadelphia's chances in this game. However, the Celtics did prove in game 1 that they know what Philadelphia does well and were able to be incredibly effective at limiting their production in those aspects, most notably Philadelphia's ability to shoot the 3 and Ben Simmons' ability to drive the lane because he's not really able to score outside the paint. Boston was incredibly effective at doing both of those things. And while Philadelphia is going to make adjustments, it's not outrageous to think that Boston can replicate maybe not a performance to that kind of level, but defensively still be able to lock them down for the most part in that regard. What's really going to matter for Boston is if they're going to be able to hit the amount of shots that they did in the first game, which is likely that they won't, but that doesn't mean that they won't be able to win the game, even if they aren't shooting as hot. But it should be 2 really exciting games tonight. I'm definitely looking forward to both of those, as those should be really exciting series. 2 series that I think have the potential to go 7 games. And early on, it's always exciting to see how, how the results of game 1 impact how teams adjust moving ahead to game 2. And I think especially when the road team wins game 1, how does a home team adjust for game 2? So I'm very curious to see how Toronto makes those adjustments tonight, looking to at least split those first 2 games at home. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you for tuning in for this episode of Pick and Pop, and we'll be back tomorrow talking about 2 game 2s today and what we have ahead of the Western Conference for tomorrow night.